Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today, Professor Mark Goodacre joins us. Mark Goodacre is the Francis Hill Fox Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University, North Carolina, USA. He has written extensively on the Synoptic Problem, that is, the origins of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These books include Thomas and the Gospels, the case for Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptic tradition, Thomas and the Gospels, the making of an apocryphal text, the case against Q, the Synoptic Problem, a way through the maze, and Golder and the Gospels. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Farrer hypothesis, which is the position that Luke did use Matthew and Matthew used Mark in turn. So, Professor Goodacre, let's start off with talking about why do scholars assume that Luke is ignorant of Matthew and just uses Mark directly, and they explain everything else away by Q. What's the deal there?
Sure. Well, hi, Jacob, and many thanks for the invitation on to the show. And I should also apologize that you've had to wait so long, because you asked me months ago, and so I really appreciate your patience on that. I've just had like the craziest, busiest year
I understand. That's fine.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a curious one. I mean, it's difficult because it's always difficult to prove a negative, isn't it? And what the two-source theory tries to do is to demonstrate that Luke could not, would not, did not know, use, have anything to do with Matthew's gospel. And from that idea that Luke is ignorant of Matthew, you have to proceed from there to, well, in that case, where did they get all the stuff that's common to Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark? And so they come up with a bunch of very interesting arguments, none of which I personally find convincing, but they come up with a bunch of quite interesting arguments that suggest that Luke couldn't possibly have had a copy of Matthew, even though he's got this material that he shares with Matthew. I can go into some of the detail on that if you're interested, but of course, my take is going to be slightly jaundiced.
Yeah, I would like you to expand on that. Yeah.
Sure. Well, okay. But the biggest one I think that gets used over and over again is that Luke couldn't possibly have known Matthew's gospel, because if he had, he wouldn't have destroyed Matthew's beautiful order. So Matthew, for example, has got these 5 discourses very clearly demarcated. They're in Matthew 5 to 7, Matthew 10, Matthew 13, Matthew 18, and Matthew 24 to 25. And after each one of those, you get when Jesus had finished these sayings or these parables or whatever it is in the hearing of the people, and then boom, we go on to the next bit of narrative. And people say it's just a beautiful structure. Everybody can see it. It's really straightforward to navigate your way through. Why wouldn't Luke have used Matthew's 5 beautiful discourses? And I think the answer to that, from my point of view, is an obvious. Do you want me just to do their arguments first? I shouldn't sort of go straight into what I think's wrong with it. I should go for that first. Shall I do one more of probably the other number one reason why people say that Luke couldn't have used Matthew?
Yeah.
The other really major one that people tend to focus on is that if Luke knew Matthew, then they say that you would expect every single time that Matthew and Luke have a saying of Jesus in common, that Matthew should look more primitive than Luke. And what they say you in fact see is that sometimes Matthew and sometimes Luke looks more primitive. So there are a couple of textbook examples of this. One of the absolute textbook examples, the number one case that everybody gives, is the first beatitude. In Matthew's gospel, in Matthew 5:3, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In Luke 6:20, Luke's version of that, you have not blessed are the poor in spirit, but you have blessed are the poor, no in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of God. And what two-source theorists universally say is that Luke could not have made his beatitude on the basis of Matthew's, because Matthew's clearly looks secondary. They say that Luke's looks more primitive. Luke's is the one that clearly sounds much more like you would expect the historical Jesus to speak, and therefore much more like you would posit for a document like Q. So they're the 2 big arguments. One is Luke would not have destroyed Matthew's beautiful order, And the other is that Luke quite often has more primitive versions of the sayings that he shares with Matthew, and he shouldn't have that. If he's using Matthew, he should always be secondary to Matthew. So that, in a nutshell, is the case. And of course, it's always difficult representing 200 years worth of scholarship in a nutshell. But hey, we're amongst friends, so why not try?
What do you feel? How do you feel about the Matthean posteriority hypothesis that they try to explain the issue away by saying Matthew used Luke and Mark?
It's got some things going for it. I recently wrote an article about this, which, if anyone's interested, I can give more details about. And it's called basically "Why Not Matthew's Use of Luke." The easiest answer is that I actually think Luke had a copy of Matthew's Gospel. I think Luke knew Matthew's Gospel. I'm not playing a game. So obviously I think this is wrong, the idea that Matthew used Luke. But there's a couple of really important things that are right about it. One is that, like the Farrer theory, this theory, the Matthean posteriority hypothesis, still places Mark in first position. This is just such an important gain in scholarship. When I was beginning my career 2 or 3 decades ago, the chief rival to the two-source hypothesis was the hypothesis that's generally known either as the two-gospel hypothesis or the Griesbach hypothesis, where Mark is not the first gospel, it's the third gospel to have been written. And that's now not held by many people at all. So I like the fact that Matthean posteriority stresses Markan Priority. Mark is the first gospel. That's a really key building stone. I call that the cornerstone that you build other things on. And the other thing I really like about Matthean posteriority is that direct line in that nice diagram that you've got on the screen here. You can see a direct line between Luke and Matthew. And so that direct line is actually doing similar work to the direct line that I draw from Matthew to Luke. It's just that I think they've got it in the wrong direction. And I can illustrate why I think they've got things in the wrong direction. And just very briefly, one of the things is that you can quite often find Matthew's fingerprints, his editorial fingerprint, turn up in Luke, which is just the kind of thing you'd expect to see if Luke is using Matthew's gospel. So little characteristic phrases and little kind of redactional tweaks that Matthew has pop up in Luke's gospel. And that'd be kind of difficult to explain on the idea that Matthew is using Luke. But there's a range of reasons why. I mean, Luke to me looks like a much later gospel. It's all the signs are that it's written a little later than Matthew, not just because Luke seems to have known Matthew, but for other external reasons as well, which I'd be happy to go into, but I don't know how much detail people want on that.
Yeah, I would like you to go into detail on that, if you don't mind.
All right then. Well, one of the issues then is that Luke's gospel, I think, is written by somebody who is familiar with the works of Josephus. Josephus published his Antiquities of the Jews in the 90s of the first century, and Luke, both in the Gospel and in Acts, has several figures mentioned who also turn up in Josephus, and the way that he presents several of these figures have remarkable similarities with the way that Josephus presents these people in the Antiquities. So that means that Luke must be written after the 90s of the first century. For Matthew to be later than that, you run into some real difficulties. And one of the issues that I think compounds this is that when you look at Matthew's gospel, one of the things that Matthew does as much as he possibly can is he corrects Mark's political figures where he can. So Mark doesn't seem to know the name of the high priest who was responsible for sentencing Jesus in Mark's gospel. He just calls him the high priest. Matthew calls him Caiaphas. Mark has various other things like that. So Mark kind of knows about Herod and Herodias, but he's a little bit hazy on some of the political details there. Well, Matthew doesn't seem to do much to correct Mark towards Josephus, whereas Luke does. So in the story of John the Baptist's beheading, for example, Matthew still carries over the idea that Herod, the one that's married to Herodias, used to be married to Philip. That contradicts what Josephus says, and Luke doesn't have that detail. So when you bring in external players into the business, like Josephus, it looks like Luke not only knows Mark and Matthew, but also knows Josephus. It's much, much harder to make that case when you're looking at Matthew's gospel. So there's a range of things like that make it look like Luke is a slightly later document. And just to throw a couple of very brief things in as well. Sometimes people talk about John's gospel as being one of the latest of the canonical gospels because you have things like the constant reference to people being cast out of the synagogue in John 9, in John 12, John 16. You get this idea that people are going to be cast out of the synagogue. And this is often said to reflect a late first century, early second century setting. But what's less often noticed is that Luke has the same phenomenon. The whole gospel ministry of Jesus begins with Jesus getting cast out of the synagogue in Nazareth in Luke 4:16-30. And then when we get to those Beatitudes and woes that we've already mentioned, there's a blessing on those who are persecuted and whose name is cast out as evil, which makes sense in a similar kind of context to the one that you see in John's gospel. So Luke to me just looks like a later generation gospel. He even in the beginning of the gospel says that this is a gospel that is written after many have attempted to set these things down in dialogue in narrative form. So I think Luke looks like a later product than Matthew does, and I obviously I could go into detail on individual kind of parallels, but I think the more that one gets stuck into the detail, the more that one realizes that the line that we should be drawing is the line on the right of the screen from Matthew to Luke rather than the one on the left of the screen. I'm not sure why the diagram for fire is in black and white. Is that's a worrying sign? Does that mean that we're a bit more monochrome as Pharaoh people?
How do you feel about
here's more color.
The Streeter hypothesis of all of these additional hypothetical documents?
Well, yeah, I tell you what I like about it. One of the geniuses of B.H. Streeter. I mean, I don't know how many of the viewers will know about Streeter's work, but Streeter wrote this brilliant book in 1924 called The Four Gospels. And in many senses, it became a textbook for generations on how the Gospels were composed. And there's a reason why it's so popular. It's that his synoptic solution, which is broadly represented here on screen, makes a really compelling way of teaching the material. I know this because I used to teach the material this way. I used to start off by talking about there being 4 different kinds of material. Mark material, that's the red in the diagram. Q material, that's the green in the diagram. M material, that's the kind of bluey color in the diagram. And L material, that's the yellow material in the diagram. And there are your 4 types of material. And Streeter's genius is to say 4 types of material, 4 sources. So where you've got Markan material, i.e. the material that's in all 3 Gospels, that comes from Mark. Where you've got Q material that comes in just Matthew and Luke, that comes from Q. Where you've got stuff that's just in Matthew, that comes from M. Where you've got stuff just in Luke, that comes from L. So it's a beautifully simple model that helps you to map the data really successfully. The problem, of course, is that every time you get a nice, simple model like this, when you put it under the microscope, you realize that it collapses. In fact, you don't even need to put it under the microscope. You just have to start scraping at the surface of it. There are so many anomalies and so many problems and so many blurrings between these neat 4 categories that actually the entire model, I think, breaks down. So although Streeter was a genius and his book is a classic, and actually I think he was absolutely right about John's Gospel, but even though Streeter's work is work of genius, I think it's been very misleading to generations of people because it's made them look at the synoptic data in line with his solution rather than just looking at the data fresh themselves.
Do you think that there could have been sources that the Gospels did use that we don't have, but they're not properly represented by any of the hypothetical document hypothesis?
Yes, I think unquestionably. And the way that I would put this is, I do not have skepticism about the existence of lost sources. And that sounds a bit stupid, no, existence of lost sources, but let me rephrase it as, I'm not skeptical that there were sources that didn't survive. There must have been sources that didn't survive. What I'm skeptical about is our ability as scholars to reconstruct those sources. See, what happens is, I think, is that lots of scholars think that they can do complex archaeology on the textual data of the synoptics. And the fact is, textual data is not an archaeological dig. It is very, very difficult to tease out sources from the material we've got. So, yes, I think there were lots of other potential sources that existed. No, I don't think we can reconstruct them or extract them from the Gospels. The only really successful work that we can do is looking at whether or not the extant sources, the surviving sources, Matthew, Mark, Luke in this diagram, actually have any relation to one another. And that's where I think we can see, in fact, there is a very clear, very easy way of seeing them in relation to one another. Matthew and Luke use Mark, and Luke also uses Matthew as well as Mark. And I think so yes, there were definitely other sources. I'm sure of it.
How do you feel about those that defend the existence of the Q document by using the brood of vipers in Matthew and Luke?
So sorry, I didn't catch the beginning bit. How do I feel about what? Sorry.
Those that defend the existence of the Q document by using the brood of vipers in Matthew and Luke.
Well, I mean, they're some of my friends, so I feel good about them. But when it comes down to the academic argument, one of the things I would say is that the bit you're talking about is in both Matthew 3 and Luke 3, John the Baptist gets up and he says to the people that are coming for baptism, in Matthew it's Pharisees and Sadducees, and Luke it's the crowds. He says, "Brood of vipers, who warned you to escape from the coming wrath?" And that fascinating 100% agreement between Matthew and Luke is a really good test case for, is this Q or is this Luke knowing Matthew? Now, the reason why it makes much better sense as Luke's using Matthew is that this is the kind of way that people talk in Matthew, not just John the Baptist, but Jesus too. So you begin with an offensive vocative, brood of vipers. You get this lots in Matthew's gospel. In fact, you even get brood of vipers twice again. So you get brood of vipers, and then you get the rhetorical question, who warned you to escape from the coming wrath? That's the way that people deliver sentences of judgment in Matthew. So that's one of those redactional fingerprints of the kind that I'm talking about. And if you carry on reading through the rest of those couple of verses, you find that they're full of similar Matthean style imagery, rhythms, that kind of thing. So that's a good example of where I think the Farrer theory works much better than Q.
I remember in the book, The Case Against Q, you talked about Matthew spiritualizing the Beatitudes. Why do scholars tend to think that Matthew and Luke, their Beatitudes, like in Luke's gospel, the Beatitudes are in some cases poorer than what's in Matthew? They'll say that. So they use that to deduce, or as you say, tease out the Q document. Why does that not work in your view?
It's a tough one. I mean, when I was writing that book, it's about 20 years ago now. Well, it's over 20 years ago that I wrote it. It was published 20 years ago. I was struck by the fact that when I tried to dig down into why people actually said that Matthew was spiritualizing the Q beatitude, what the actual grounds for this were, and I found that in the main, it was something that was asserted rather than argued. It was regarded as self-evident. And I think one of the reasons it seems self-evident to lots of moderns is that lots of moderns, Christians and non-Christians alike, quite like the idea of Jesus as a social gospel radical preacher who goes around with a beneficial treatment of the poor. We all love that. I love that. So we like the idea of Jesus blessing the poor. We tend in our culture, and Dale Allison has called this secularizing Jesus. We tend in our culture to try and take away from anything that might make Jesus sound a bit too religious and spiritual. So if we can say Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," our culture kind of likes that way more than "blessed are the poor in spirit," because for a start, we don't really know what "blessed are the poor in spirit" really means. And in fact, translators have had to devil of a job trying to tease out what that actually means. So my argument was, well, could it go the other way? Could it be that Luke found blessed are the poor in spirit in his source in Matthew and thought, well, hold on a minute, this doesn't quite sound right. Let's see if we can kind of adjust it. And actually, in fact, we find that Luke does this all the time. So the sermon I was just talking about, beginning of Jesus's ministry in Luke 4:16-30, where you have Jesus in the Nazareth synagogue, he there begins that sermon by saying, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, not the poor in spirit, the poor. So why would we think it's unusual that Luke wants to write the poor in the first beatitude in his next big sermon, which is the Sermon on the Plain in Luke 6? So it's just the kind of thing you'd expect Luke to do. And what's more, if Luke has a blessing on someone, there's often a paired curse. So in the cases of the Beatitudes and woes, you've got a blessing on the poor, but you've also got a woe on the rich. Very Lucan thing to do. You even have a parable which is all about the reversal of fortunes for the poor and the rich. The parable of the rich man Lazarus in Luke 16 has the rich man getting cast down to Hades, while Lazarus, the poor man, is raised up. He receives that reward. So that's a characteristic Lucan thing to do. So it makes much better sense, in my view, to have the Matthean beatitude as Luke's source material when he's doing his Blessed are the Poor.
Why do you think Luke modifies some of it to make it sound more primitive in some cases than what's in Matthew?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think to some extent, every writer tries to do this. If you're doing any kind of, if you imagine a contemporary who's writing an autobiography, nobody wants their autobiography to be less authentic to its subject than the previous one written, right? You want it to be more authentic. So you every sorry, did I say autobiography? If it's an autobiography, then that's very strange. So biography. Every biographer wants his or her biography to be better than the previous one. They want it to be more authentic, in that sense, more primitive. And I think Matthew, for that matter, is doing that with Mark. I think when Matthew takes over Mark's gospel, Matthew realizes that Mark's Jesus is in some respects less, and I'm going to have to use something I don't like to do, which is scare quotes, but less Jewish than Matthew's Jesus is. So Mark's Jesus sits very lightly towards the law. Matthew's Jesus less so. Matthew's Jesus is probably closer to the historical Jesus. No one says that means Matthew must be an earlier gospel. What they say is that sometimes Matthew makes an adjustment in the way that Mark presents things and makes an adjustment to what he sees as the authentic Jesus. Luke is doing the same thing. Sometimes when he comes across material in Mark, he gives versions of it that sound more, and I hate that word primitive, but I saw that my friend Robin Walsh was on your show the other week, and she problematized this word primitive for me a few months ago at a conference. And ever since then, I hate using it. It's because it's a really bizarre word to be using. But anyway, we can talk about kind of later and earlier texts. But when Luke is recasting material from Mark and from Matthew, quite often, I think he realizes that what he wants to do is reach back to make it more like what he thinks Jesus was like, more like what he actually said. So he's making those adjustments. We can see him doing it when he's working with Mark. So it's no stretch at all to see him doing the same thing when he's working with Matthew. It far from it being a problem for my theory. It's what you should expect. You should expect that. Even to some extent, John's gospel, for all its obvious remove in time from the events it's describing, does certain things to try and make its Jesus more authentic or more like it thinks Jesus was than the synoptic one.
I'm curious, how do you feel about those that let me rephrase that question. What do you think of the argument that Mark used Josephus? Because I know that there's some scholars that make that argument.
Yeah, I don't see it, because if Mark had used Josephus, he might have been able to cross-check some of his more problematic material. The most obvious one being Mark 6, where we have the death of John the Baptist. And you have this very confusing opening where Mark seems to say that Herodias used to be married to Philip, and Josephus doesn't say that. What Josephus says is that Herodias used to be married to someone called Herod, another Herod. And what's more, it's Herodias's daughter Salome who was married to someone called Philip, right? So it looks like Mark doesn't have that detail right, and that Josephus does. And therefore, it's kind of odd if Mark, Mark, you would have thought would have gone and kind of checked against Josephus for that. So I think it's more just there's a lack of really obvious parallels between Mark and Josephus to make that work. I mean, heck, some people even deny that Luke knows Josephus, even though I think Steve Mason's made a fantastic case for it. Some people even doubt that. So it's very hard to make the case for Mark's knowledge of Josephus. Plus, I tend to think Mark is a bit earlier, at least than Josephus was writing the Antiquities. I think Mark makes better sense in the 70s, really, than pushing it right to the end of the 1st century. You then get things very congested at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, if you go down that line.
There are others that think that Mark used Wars of the Jews instead of the Antiquities, and they put Mark sandwiched in between the two, and some think that the apocalyptic preaching of Jesus ben Ananus was used by Mark to frame his Jesus in the story.
Yeah, I hear that. I think there's a much better case though for Matthew and Luke being familiar. Sorry, not Matthew and Luke. Let me go back. I think there's a better case for the parallels between Jesus ben Ananus, who predicts the destruction of the temple, and the Jesus that we see in Matthew and Luke. The parallels there are somewhat clearer than are the parallels between Mark's Jesus and Josephus's Jesus ben Ananus. So it's just one of those things. I mean, I would be very excited if it turns out that a really, really good case could be made for Mark's knowledge of Josephus, but I didn't see it at the moment. It's just the detail's just not there. Even with Luke, I can't state it with 100% certainty. What you have to just say, there's always the possibility that Luke knew Josephus's sources, or he heard Josephus doing some kind of oral presentation and took notes or something like that. My hunch is that he does know Josephus just because of the way that he talks about certain things, especially Theudas and Judas in Acts of the Apostles, and to some extent the Egyptian in Acts of the Apostles as well. It's just too hard to make the case for Mark, I think.
The Gospel of Thomas, when it was found at Nag Hammadi, scholars rejoiced and said, "Oh, look at this! This is a Gnostic version of Q." Now, there are some scholars that say, I know there's not many that say this, but there's a couple that might think that will say that Thomas is Q. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on both of those arguments.
Yeah, I think the idea. So first off, I think this is a bit of a myth. The idea that first, the idea that Q skeptics were kind of silenced when the Gospel of Thomas was discovered is kind of nonsense. There's just no evidence of it. I mean, and the idea that somehow for years Q skeptics had been saying there's nothing like Q ever been discovered, and then the Gospel of Thomas comes along and everyone goes, oh my goodness, now something like Q's been discovered, Q must be right after all. It's just it's too simplistic and it's too fanciful a story. I mean, even though it's one that's been told to me many times, you go searching across the history to see if this corresponds to reality, and it doesn't at all. What people, where it comes from, it's got an origin. Where it comes from is Austin Farrer, whose name is the one that's lent to this hypothesis, the Farrer hypothesis. He wrote an article in 1955 called On Dispensing with Q. And in that article, which incidentally was written after the Gospel of Thomas had been discovered, although Farrer doesn't reference it. But when Farrer writes that article, he does make the case that nothing like Q can be found in antiquity. He does say something like that. But what he means, and he's explicit about this, is what he says is a gospel like Q, which begins with this strong narrative introduction. He calls it a narrative exordium, this strong narrative introduction patterned on the Old Testament, then dissipating into miscellaneous oracles. And what he meant was Q looks like someone has started trying to write a narrative gospel and then given up. And while it's possible that you can point to kind of generic similarities to documents that have strong narrative introductions and then kind of dissipate, Farah's point was you will struggle to find anything that does that in the way that Q is supposed to have done it. And then when Thomas turns up, it's nothing like that. So Thomas, I argue, in my case against Q, Thomas actually confirms what a true sayings gospel actually looks like. One where it thinks that salvation comes from listening to Jesus's words. Q doesn't seem to believe that. Q actually thinks that Jesus's actions and miracles are more important because it says so. So it's a I just don't buy that argument at all. I think it's a very nice piece of rhetoric, but it actually doesn't correspond to the history.
And how do you feel about those that will say? How do you feel about the argument that in which, oh look, Papias, he mentions that Aristian's sayings of the Lord, or perhaps it's talking about John's sayings of the Lord. What do you think of this argument?
Well, in some respects, this is what the origin of the Q hypothesis is. I mean, there were a lot of scholars in the 19th century who were very attracted to the idea of lost gospel sources. And what they were doing was they were on a quest for lost gospel sources. In fact, before you had Markan Priority, you had the idea of a kind of pre-Markan gospel. So we didn't just have a Q, or as they then called it, the Logia, but we also had a kind of pre-Markan gospel. So there was always this quest for the older gospels, the lost gospels. It's that, we still love it today. I mean, that's why we enjoy watching the Raiders of the Lost Ark and so on. We like the idea of kind of recovering lost treasure. And they were just the same in the 19th century. And so what was going on was they knew this material from Papias, and they knew Papias referred to these logia, and then they went searching for those logia in the Gospels and said, oh, hold on a minute, maybe it's this Q material. So in some senses, it puts the cart before the horse, because what you need to do is begin with the material within the Gospels and say, can we make any sense of this in terms of the relation between the Gospels? And I would say you actually absolutely can, because you can see, I think, that Matthew used Mark, Luke used Matthew and Mark, and that Matthew used Mark and Luke used Matthew and Mark. Oh, I said it right, didn't I? Yeah. But so Papias doesn't help us there. What Papias is actually talking about when he talks about the logia is Matthew's Gospel, I think.
We have a super chat question, so I'm going to take the slide off for a second.
Sure.
Donnie Springer, thank you for the $10 super chat. Dr. Goodacre, can you explain why Mark is considered a complete first account rather than a redaction of a lost gospel that contains narrative and most of the material in Matthew about the infancy?
It's a good question, and I mean, let's take it in two steps. One is, do we know for certain that what we have in canonical Mark, what we have in our Greek New Testaments today, corresponds to the gospel that person wrote back in 75 or whenever it is? And of course, it's an approximation. We don't have the autographs. It's an approximation. And even then, beyond that, we always would have to say, well, could it be that the Mark's gospel that was known to Matthew and Luke was different from our reconstruction of Mark? Almost certainly. How different, we don't know. Now, that would be the first thing I say. So yes, there clearly were other versions of Mark around. Even in the text of Mark that we have the vast majority of them featuring a longer ending, and only a tiny number that lack verses 16, verses 9 to 20, which we now almost everybody regards as being secondary. So even in the stuff we've got different versions of Mark, and that's just to take the ending. There's all sorts of other things you could pull out from within the text itself. So you do have different versions of Mark from antiquity, and I don't rule out that early versions of Mark could have been quite substantially different from the Mark that we have. The second bit of this question, though, actually talks about the possibility that Mark could himself have redacted something that more closely corresponds to Matthew. Let me just read that bit again. A redaction of a lost gospel that contains narrative and most of the material in Matthew. The reason why I don't buy that is that I think when I look at Matthew's gospel, it is so easy in passage after passage after passage to make sense of it as the writer of the Gospel of Matthew working directly from the Gospel of Mark. It looks so often like Matthew has something that is very close to what we call Mark's Gospel in front of him. And I'll give you perhaps the easiest way to do it is with an example. I wrote an article in 1998, worrying how long ago that is now, but in 1998 called Fatigue in the Synoptics, in which I argued that you can often see Matthew adapting Mark's narratives in such ways that show Matthew to be secondary to Mark. And what he will do is he'll make little corrections at the beginning of a particular passage, but then he will lapse into the wording of his source as he goes through. Now, that kind of material makes much better sense if Matthew is using Mark than if Mark is using some kind of pre-Matthean gospel of some sort. The example I tend to like to give is a passage we've already mentioned today, is the death of John the Baptist, where Mark begins in Mark 6 by calling his protagonist King Herod, and Matthew corrects this to Herod the Tetrarch. But then half through the passage in Matthew 14:9, he reverts to calling him the king along with Mark. Now, that is the kind of thing where it looks like our Matthew or something corresponding to our Matthew is using our Mark or something corresponding to our Mark, and not that our Mark is using some sort of pre-Matthean gospel. But it's a great question, and it reminds us that we will never attain certainty on these things because there will always be interesting different ways of modeling the data.
I want to get into now Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptic Gospels. And to talk about Thomas and the Gospels, the case for Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptics. I just made this little slide here
Cool.
showing one of the examples: Matthew 26:61, Mark 14:58, and Thomas 71, paralleling each other. Could you explain to the audience what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, this is from the Passion narrative in Matthew's Gospel and Mark's Gospel, and you've got people that are described variously as false witnesses, saying that they'd heard Jesus say he'll destroy the temple made with hands after 3 days and build another not made with hands. And is that quotation quite right? Oh yeah, I, with hands after. I think there's something slightly missing there, isn't there? I will destroy this temple made with hands. And then it should be, I think it should be, and after 3 days, I'll build another. Anyway. And then Matthew 26:61, likewise, I think carries that over. What's interesting about the Gospel of Thomas is that several scholars have argued, and I kind of echo this in my book, argue that Thomas refers to a slightly later phase after the Bar Kokhba War in the 130s, where the idea of rebuilding the temple is completely off the agenda. And there seems to have been an interesting passage of time here. In the Synoptics, it's purely talking about the temple being destroyed, but then there being a kind of rebuilding of the temple in Jesus's body. But it's gone on a bit from that in Thomas, insofar as it now seems that the idea of rebuilding the temple is off the agenda.
I just wanted to, I looked at page 168 in the book. Yeah, I quoted it exactly as it is in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So what you do here is, when you demonstrate that Thomas is familiar with the Synoptic Gospels, you also add that with another layer of evidence that Thomas is a lot different from the Q document. Thomas is not as similar to the hypothetical Q document as some would like it to be.
Sorry, just say that again. I'm still worrying about the 3 days. There's some punctuation or something on there, because it doesn't make sense to say in Mark, I will destroy this temple made with hands after 3 days. That's the bit sorry, that's the bit I was staring at.
I might have had a type. That might have been a type.
I'm a text nerd, so so I'm a details person. But anyway, sorry, I'll try not to stare at it. I'm holding my hand up in front of it now. Sorry, what were you asking, Jacob, again?
So what I was asking is, You pointed out that Thomas is very familiar with the Synoptics. You have a lot of examples of this in your book, Thomas and the Gospels. But you also point out that Thomas is not as similar to the Q document as some would like to believe.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think it's nothing like it, personally. Yeah. I think it's a mirage.
How different is it, if you can point out some examples?
I mean, so the obvious thing is, when you look at the Gospel of Thomas, people may not be familiar with this, but when you look at Gospel of Thomas, many of its sayings just go, Jesus says, da da da. Jesus says, da da da. Jesus says, da da da. And then you'll suddenly have Peter said, and Jesus replied. And then you get Salome said, and Jesus replied. And that's basically the entire structure of the Gospel of Thomas across the entire sayings. There is no narrative continuity in it. So although one saying might build on top of another in terms of building up the kind of the content and the kind of theological world of Thomas, there's no cause and effect. Q's not like that, at least, and people might think it's weird me saying what Q's like since I don't believe in it. But when I'm talking about what Q's like, I'm talking about the way it's reconstructed by the people that believe in it. And the way that Q is reconstructed by those who think it existed is as a document that begins with a very strong narrative basis. It begins like Mark's Gospel with John the Baptist. John the Baptist preaches a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. He prophesies a coming one, hoekomenos in Greek, and then Jesus goes and gets baptized, becoming the Son. This is in Q as well, according to most of its defenders. And then from there, we go to the temptation story where the devil says to Jesus, if you are the Son of God, building on the baptism. And then you go on to the sermon. And then after the sermon, it says, when Jesus had finished these sayings in the hearing of the people, he goes to Capernaum, and then the centurion's boy is healed. And so it goes on. So in Q, as it's reconstructed by people that think it's the source of Matthew and Luke, Q keeps building one passage on the next, on the next, on the next. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense if Q is actually the bits of Matthew that Luke has extracted, because that's exactly what you'd expect to see on the basis that Luke has used Matthew. Because what I think is that Luke's used Mark as the backbone of his gospel, but then he's pulling in stuff from Matthew. That's why lots of that narrative structure is retained in the gospel. So it actually doesn't look anything like Thomas. It has long discourses. It has big, long discourses. It doesn't have these punchy little sayings like Thomas has.
Benjamin Love, thank you for the $10 super chat. People often say Mark's Greek was vulgar and unsophisticated. Was Matthew and Luke written to rewrite Mark at a higher level of sophistication, and Mark would be dropped in favor of Matthew or Luke?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. I mean, it is kind of true. I mean, when I was 18 years old, I started learning Greek as part of my degree in Oxford, and I was delighted to be learning Mark's Gospel as the first text we looked at. And if you've done that, then you kind of, Mark is your first love. And so you don't tend to think of Mark as being terribly vulgar in his Greek, because that's the Greek that you learn to love first. But yes, of course, if you compare Mark with a much more sophisticated literary style, it does look kind of colloquial, and I wouldn't say vulgar. I rather like the colloquial nature of Mark's Greek, and you know, it's things like and immediately, and then and immediately, half broken sentences, that kind of thing. But it is true that Matthew's and Luke's Greek is more sophisticated. There's just no question about it, especially Luke's. Luke's vocabulary is far larger than Matthew's or Mark's, for example. Incidentally, it's one of the reasons why people often think that Luke is more primitive, because Luke has such a large vocabulary that he won't just say things like consider the birds of the air. He'll say consider the ravens, right? So, you know, specify what kind of birds you're thinking of. So yes, I think Matthew and Luke are written to rewrite Mark at a high level of sophistication to a large degree. And what is surprising is that Mark still survives. In fact, I'm reading a book at the moment by Francis Watson, which I've just picked up, called What is a Gospel? And he actually has an article in there asking, why did Mark survive? And it's a really great question. And one of the possibilities is it was already so popular by the time that Matthew and Luke were writing that their writing didn't actually absorb it, in the sense that people still wanted to read Mark, even though they knew that what they got in Matthew and to some extent Luke was revised versions of Mark.
Benjamin Lovinger to think of it $5, but then they kept Mark because they thought the robbers and hookers would like it. Go sell the hooker championship tonight.
It's not so easy to comment on that one, but certainly Mark's gospel has a natural charm to it. I used the phrase "brutish genius" once, in that it's written with a kind of flair for the dramatic. I mean, where Matthew and Luke quite often leave key details unspoken, Mark's the one that says that, there's green grass when at the feeding of the 5,000. He's also the person that talks about saliva going on the blind man's eyes, or Jesus putting fingers in people's ears. So Mark is the gospel that has so many of those memorable details, and Mark is so often the more memorable one when it comes to certain key pieces.
Thank you for those super chats, Benjamin. Some will say that how could Q not exist? Because how did Thomas know to sniff out the exact same sayings in Matthew and Luke that was predicted in the Q document hypothesis? How do you feel? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons. That's because it's not true. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think that the Q hypothesis is problematic. If you actually look at the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, they come from all strands of gospel material, not just the Q stuff. There is tons and tons of triple tradition material in there. In other words, stuff that comes in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There is also tons of stuff in there that's only in Matthew. There's also quite a bit of stuff that's only in Luke. Interestingly, that's the smallest proportion. There's only about 4 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that are found solely in Luke's Gospel. It's difficult, how to count them. But there are lots of that M material, so-called special Matthew. There's lots of Q material, so-called the double tradition. There's lots of triple tradition. And in fact, one of the best arguments for Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptic Gospels is that Thomas doesn't seem to have ignorance of any of those strands. You can even break it down further than that and say that Thomas even seems to know minor agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark, major agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark, and so on. It's quite striking. Incidentally, the same thing can be said about John. John has knowledge of every strand of material in the Synoptics. That makes it much more likely that you're dealing with a literary link than that you're dealing with somebody who knows a body of oral tradition or some kind of sayings document. Because if you were dealing with that, you would expect an entire kind of group of material to be absent, like, say, M material or L material or Q material, and that just doesn't happen.
By the way, here's something funny. So I decided to look earlier at that slide. I realized what you were talking about. I was slightly confused. I was missing one additional punctuation mark.
Thanks. I know. I'm sorry to be I'm sorry that I was
No,
distracted by that, but
no,
it
that's
is the
okay. I
curse of the
completely
tech
understand.
nerd.
I completely understand. But it was funny. But yeah. So Thomas, what would you date the Gospel of Thomas? Because there's I'm trying to remember his church father's name. I forget his
I
name.
think the earliest. Sorry, I talked over you. I beg your pardon.
No, it's okay. There was a particular church father that said that Thomas was written by a different Thomas, the disciple of Mani, in the 3rd century AD.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you buy that?
No, but I do think that. And one thing I'm certain of is that we don't know who the author is. I mean, the author's claiming to be the twin brother of Jesus, I think. I mean, 1:1 says Thomas. Sorry, it's written by Judas Didymus Thomas. And the words Didymus and Thomas are basically 2 words, one Greek and one Aramaic, meaning twin. Our name, Thomas, actually, people that are called Thomas, it's derived from Christianity, where that word for twin goes into the common language as being a first name. But it's not written by him, or I doubt it's written by any other Thomas, although it's, of course, perfectly possible. And I think it was probably written no earlier than the end of the Bar Kokhba War in the 130s. And I think it could be as late as the middle to second half of the 2nd century. But my best guess would be around about the 140s or so. It's actually contemporary, I think, with several other texts that do quite similar things. You often see, even Justin Martyr, who's writing in the middle of the 2nd century, when he works from the Synoptics, quite often harmonizes the material in a similar way to the way that Thomas does. And in my book, I show there's 1 or 2 parallels between the way that Justin Martyr uses his synoptic material with the way that the Gospel of Thomas uses its synoptic material. But it was something you get a lot in the 2nd century, where you've got these synoptic texts, and to some extent John and other texts, of course, as well, are competing for people's attention. And those that people are getting to hear regularly in church, or being regularly performed, or they're reading regularly, they tend sometimes to blend in people's minds. And so you get these fascinating synthesized versions of synoptic texts.
Why do you date it right around or just shortly after the Bar Kokhba revolt?
It's mainly that saying 71 that you brought up earlier on. The question of saying, by saying that the house is going to be destroyed and it will not be able to be rebuilt, it's the resonance of that it sounds like the Bar Kokhba War is recent in the same way that 70 is recent to the writing of Mark's Gospel. Now, that's just a hunch. There's no way that you could demonstrate that that's the case. That's just a hunch.
Just
but
for
yes,
those that missed the slide earlier, it's on the far right, Thomas 71.
Yes, it's no one will be able to rebuild it. Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing would have been hostage to fortune if you said that in the 70s, because I think lots of people then would have expected the temple to be rebuilt, as it was in the exile in the 6th century BCE. There's this kind of hope of the rebuilding of the temple. So I think that would explain something of Thomas's location, but it's not dead cert. I mean, with all these dating things, you're working with guesses. And one thing that is worth saying is that our earliest manuscript evidence of the Gospel of Thomas is remarkably early. We have these 3 Greek fragments from Oxyrhynchus. They're called P Oxy 1, 654, and 655. Now, these all date from around the early to the middle 3rd century. Now, that is fantastically early. That's earlier than many of our very early texts of the Synoptics and John. So fragments of Thomas sit alongside fragments of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John as being pretty impressively early.
Another super chat from Donnie Springer.
Great.
Thank you for the $10. There are early accounts about Mark's sequencing being wrong. What do you think about the possibility of the section containing Matthew 10 being the original ending of the gospel moved to hide Jews only common? I couldn't quite make out the ending of that.
Yeah, the ending's a little difficult to fathom there. But what do you think about the possible section containing Matthew 10 being the original ending of the gospel? That's a little difficult to fathom out. What I would say is that there are always interesting cases to be made for different sequences of given gospels working. I mean, I'm working on John's gospel at the moment, and people have often said that John 6 looks like it would make better sense if it came before John 5. So that's kind of strange that that you've got things in that order. And there's a similar thing in Luke's gospel, which has always baffled me, which is in the rejection at Nazareth story, which we've mentioned a couple of times today, in Luke chapter 4. There's an amazing line where Jesus says in Luke 4:23, "No doubt you will mention to me what happened in Capernaum," but he hasn't been to Capernaum yet in Luke. And it's really strange. And I sometimes wonder if in an earlier draft of Luke, he had the rejection of Nazareth in its Markan position in Mark 6. But then in a later draft, he moved it forward, not realizing that he'd thrown off some of the chronology. Who knows? Mark's Gospel, I find it hard to think of things sequence-wise that would work better in other directions. I suppose you see, the thing is, Austin Farrer, who we talked about earlier on, he was a real fan of Mark's creative genius, and I tend to be a little bit like that. For all that kind of vulgarity in his language we were talking about earlier on, I do think it's a very clever composition. And if you threw the order off, I think it would actually throw off all sorts of interesting things that you can see going on in Mark. I think Mark is crafted pretty carefully, actually. I suspect it's crafted by someone who went through multiple performances and multiple drafts until he or she got it how they wanted it. So I don't think I like ideas of Mark sequencing being wrong, though there's always the possibility that you could take sections out and move things around and it still work. And no doubt that would correspond to things that could have happened in the early performances of Mark. I mean, even today, people perform Mark in abridged versions and more lengthy versions and so on.
Since you were saying earlier that there could have been earlier versions of Mark, even could even potentially predate canonical Mark.
Yeah.
That made me think of another question. What do you think about the multi-source hypothesis, which has a bunch of different proto-Marks that are being hypothesized? Do you think a scenario like that is possible?
I'm happy. Multi-Gospels. I'm just wondering in the previous question whether I think I've been thrown off by the fact that Matthew. I'm wondering whether the correspondent meant Matthew 28:10, because in Matthew 28 we do have the business of the story of the disciples stealing the body, and that it would make sense to ask the question whether that could have been in an original version of Mark or something like that. So maybe that's the case. Well, anyway. Multiple gospel hypotheses, multiple source hypotheses. My teacher, Ed Sanders, used to get us to look at a French scholar called Boimard, who used to have the most complicated synoptic diagram you can imagine, with multiple sources, multiple lines, dotted lines, halfway versions of things, intermediate versions of things, sources of sources, and so on. And one of the reasons that he got us to do that was to see that if you have a model that's complex enough, it's virtually impossible to falsify. And a model like that, therefore, doesn't really teach you anything much at all, except that if you have a model complicated enough, it can take in every potential wrinkle and detail and all the rest of it. But the way that I look at these things is that history is complex and history is messy, and literary relations between texts are often complex and messy. But the more complex and messy your model is, the less likely it is to correspond to the messiness of the reality. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that my simple diagram has 3 points in common with a 20-point messy reality. Then that might be 3 points more than Boimard, who, has got kind of 20, 30, 40 points, none of which might correspond to reality. So it's really kind of ham-fisted way of putting it. But I would say that the problem is the more complex you make your model, the less likely it is to replicate anything corresponding to the reality that you're trying to describe.
John Macker, thank you for the $10. Wouldn't the fact that majority of documents from antiquity perish increase the probability that Matthew and Luke most likely shared other documents we don't have, to include Q? Q can mean anything.
It's this great question, and it goes a little bit to what we were talking about earlier on, and my skepticism about our ability as scholars to reconstruct documents rather than any kind of skepticism that such things exist. Of course, there are lost sources from antiquity. We know that there's loads of lost sources from antiquity. I mean, we've got fragmentary gospels that we would love to discover. I mean, one of them, the Egerton Gospel, we've got these tantalizing little fragments of. We know that text has been primarily lost. So yes, of course, there's lost sources. My worry about calling those Q is that Q's already got a defined body of material that goes under that kind of heading, and it's the material that is common to Matthew and Luke that's on the whole not found in Mark. And if you call that stuff Q, then you're actually depriving the reader of seeing the possibility that that material does not derive from one of these lost sources that we would so love to discover, but might actually be due to a direct line that's drawn from Matthew to Luke. So yes, I think there are lots of lost sources. No, I don't think that we should call them Qs. And I think it's also fair to say that Q does have a fairly defined meaning within New Testament scholarship. And if one wants to argue against that, one actually has to argue against a significant weight of quite important and quite well done scholarship. And I should say something that I often say in these contexts. I'm often much closer to Q scholars than I am to non-Q scholars, simply because Q scholars like me are really, really interested in the interrelations of the Gospels and the origins of Christianity. And so we have a goal shared. It's just that we differ a little bit on how we configure that evidence.
Here's a final question. Do you think most of the material that we lost in the first century, do you think most of it was destroyed during the Jewish-Roman War?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I don't. I think most of the stuff that's lost isn't really even lost in the sense that it's not like, losing my phone or losing, I'm frequently losing books in the sense that I can't remember whether it's here or whether it's in my work office or when I've lent it to somebody. We're not talking lost like that. When we're talking about ancient texts being lost, I think most of the time what we're talking about is people stopping copying them. So the reason why the Egerton Gospel that we're talking about just now is lost, apart from those few fragments that have survived, is because people stopped copying it. And there are plenty of cases of texts from antiquity that were almost completely lost, except that one copy or one fragment of one copy survives. And sometimes those are just dug up from the ground. Sometimes they're found buried with a monk and so on. I mean, Gospel of Thomas was lost for centuries, in the sense it wasn't that nobody knew how to find it. What it was is people stopped copying it. And if people stop copying a thing, then gradually it just goes to ground, and all extant copies just become part of the compost. So yeah, I think that that's really where things are on the question of lost stuff. And yeah, I hope always springs eternal though for more discoveries. We're already richer now in 2022 in terms of manuscript discoveries than we were even 20 or 30 years ago, let alone a century ago.
Well, thanks for joining me today. This has been a fascinating conversation. I would definitely like to have you back at some point.
Pleasure. Thanks, Jacob. I enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.